The Portal's inquiry is about the future we are creating. Central to this inquiry is the study of new Renaissance leaders, people endeavoring to integrate entrepreneurial and business experience with civic and artistic discovery and creative engagement. Today we are speaking with Robbie Bach. Robbie is the author of Xbox Revisited, a game plan for corporate and civic renewal, and the fictional work, The Wilkes Insurrection. Robbie was the chief Xbox officer at Microsoft, where he led the creation and development of an extraordinarily successful business. After his corporate career, Robbie focused on his evolution as a civic engineer and artist. We want to explore his ideas and what motivates him. Robbie, welcome.
Thank you for having me on. Look forward to the discussion.
So let me begin by asking, what are you working on today? What fills you with energy and joy at this time?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. First of all, I'm still writing, so I've started another book. It's a continuation of the characters and the storyline in the Wilkes Insurrection, and I'm just very early in that process. So just exploring some themes, pushing some characters forward, pulling some characters back, and just trying to get into the creative flow of that. I'm continuing my work in civics. I just stepped down as the chair of the board of the Bipartisan Policy Center, but I'll stay on that board and continue to work with them in Washington, D.C. And I have a very large commitment to Boys and Girls Clubs of America, where I'm on a number of committees and I'm a past chair and really committed to the cause of serving America's youth. And there's 3 or 4 other nonprofits that I work with, but those are the biggest ones. And then finally, just to make sure it's clear that I'm not out of the business world, I'm the co-owner of a gluten-free pasta company called Manini's, and we are a national gluten-free fresh pasta and pizza crust brand. And I'm on one corporate board, a company called Magic Leap, which makes augmented reality products. So it's a portfolio of activity. And to get to your point about joy, that's what I've discovered brings me joy. It is this task switching and going back and forth between thinking about a profit margin on, gluten-free ravioli and then trying to solve a character challenge in a book, or trying to work with somebody in Washington, D.C. to figure out how we navigate through the crazy waters that we're in. I mean, that kind of task switching and the challenge it brings to my brain is truly a joy.
Well, so what is the origin story of the policy task force that you have initiated, and what is actually inside it, the idea of being a civic engineer?
Well, so let's start with the latter first. So the concept of civic engineering wasn't something I started out with. When I left Microsoft, I said, well, I want to be engaged in the community. There's a bunch of things I'm passionate about. I'm a big believer in passion, and that if you're going to work hard, you should work on something you love and that you're into. And so, civics has always been something that's been important to me, particularly in my early life. And I just said, I want to get back to that. So I started doing the work. And I literally was in a coffee shop one day, and somebody said to me, so what's your title? And I paused and thought about that. And I said, well, it's got civics in it. Okay, so that's where the civic part come from. And I've always been jealous of all the engineers at Microsoft who I couldn't match with technical talent. So I decided I wanted to be an engineer. So I said I was a civic engineer. So the concept of civic engineering is the work we do every day to make our communities better, to make them safer, to make them work better, to make them serve the people in those communities better. And for some people, that's working literally in your little town. For some people, it's working at a broader level at the state level. And for some people, it's working at the national and even international level. And, to me, it's just that I use the word engagement a lot. It's just that engagement in what's going on and really trying to help that. So fast forward to my first book, Xbox Revisited. I wrote a draft of that and sent it to a friend who happens to be in Washington, D.C. And he says, well, you need to talk to this guy named Jason Gramey. And Jason Gourmet was the founder of the Bipartisan Policy Center. And the BPC started in the energy space as a bipartisan organization to try to solve the dual problems of energy and the environment. And how do we solve both of those problems at the same time? And it has since expanded over the last 15, 20 years into a multi-issue bipartisan group. And they write real policy. So they get Republicans and Democrats together, they do policy work, and then they lobby for that policy work on the Hill. Things like the recent infrastructure bill that got passed, the BPC played a big role in that. They're very involved in the debt ceiling discussions that are going on right now. And so Jason ultimately asked me to join that board, and then ultimately I became the chair of that board for about 3 years.
So it's pretty rare that the two sides will be talking to each other, probably unless they are involved with an endeavor like yours. What are some of the big learnings and insights from the effort to bring these two different opposing views in this highly polarized time?
I think there's a couple things I would highlight. First of all, one of the things that's changed in Washington, D.C. over the last 20 to 30 years, it used to be that senators and congressmen and congresswomen knew each other personally. They met socially. They knew people away from the job. And that has fundamentally changed. And lots of different reasons for that. They have to spend a huge amount of time fundraising. They're going back and forth to their constituent district. They're on social media. There's all these distractions from the actual policy work that they're spending time on. And that has chewed into their ability to have actual personal relationships with other representatives. So one of the things the BPC does is we try to focus on personal relationships. They have this program called the American Congressional Exchange. They take a Republican and a Democrat, and they spend 3 or 4 days in the other person's district, walking and talking with the other leader. No agenda per se, no specific policy thing, but just you're going to get to know that person and what they deal with in their district. And from that comes new policy and the ability to work together. So that's one thing that I think is, a key learning for me that has changed.
When we have relationships with somebody, it's more difficult to dehumanize and hate them.
Well, for sure. And it's also a little easier to just step out of your own shoes for a brief moment and put yourself in their position and remember that their constituency is different than yours. And that's a powerful, we all understand it intellectually, but when you've literally walked the factory floor with the person, you know that that's where you are. So that's an important thing that's changed. The other thing that I think has changed is the whole context of media. I'll say in particular social media, but broadcast media has fallen into the same trap, where all of our leaders feel like they're on 24/7. And the problem with that, God knows who wants to live that life. That's a separate problem. But the bigger problem with that is if you're on 24/7 in that world, you're constantly trying to make political points. And the fact is, when you get most of these people away from the cameras and away from the keyboard, they're actually pretty reasonable people. Now, there's some crazies on both sides. There's the 10% on both sides. It doesn't matter where you are. You may disagree with them and you may not like them. But the vast majority of people, if you get them in a quiet room and you talk about policy issue, they say, yeah, we got to figure out a way. There's got to be a way in the middle here. So what the BPC does is it gives those people a safe place to talk. And it gives those ideas a safe place to germinate. Away from the media lights, away from social media. BPC is not big on taking credit for the work it does, for better or for worse. So a lot of that just happens in the background. It's a place for people to come and talk and be in an environment where they can not feel like they're 100% on all the time. And what you discover is that what looks like a crazily divided world is actually not that divided.
And I imagine that part of it is actually creating the space to truly engage in a deliberative process. Because at the moment, when the cameras are running, people are not engaged in a deliberative process. They are engaged in making points.
No, that's exactly right. And look, I'm not a big believer that technology is good or bad. I think technology just is what it is, and it can be used for good and for bad. And social media gets used for a lot of good. There's a lot of good things that happen. But unfortunately, there's a lot of negatives and downsides to it. One of the downsides is you're on every day, all day, every minute. And by the way, it's worse than that because the representative or the senator isn't the one doing the posting. So they've hired somebody to be on 24/7. And so they don't even have to be there to make the point. And so you get this firestorm of controversy and discussion and tit for tat that just makes getting productive work done, that much more difficult.
Well, so that's an engineering problem. The fact that society is now wired to controversy and to polarization, that is an engineering problem that needs to be solved with an engineering mind.
Well, I will say this. It's both an engineering problem and it's actually a business problem.
Okay.
So I have this innovation framework that I talk about in Xbox Revisited, and I talk when I do public speaking, called BXT, which stands for Business, Experience, and Technology. And social media has a BXT problem. And the T problem is, at a technical level, what can we do to manage and to create environments where people can have productive conversations as opposed to just yelling at each other. So, and there is technology that could be applied to make that happen. The X problem, the experience problem we have is related, which is anonymity makes it easy to be a bad person. And because, people are able to go in the social media world and have an experience where they can be out of body, there's no accountability, and they can say whatever they want. And that creates some real challenges. But at the heart of all of this is a business problem. Because most social networks, let's set LinkedIn aside for a second. It's sort of a special case. But most social networks are based on what business model? Advertising. What drives advertising? Eyeballs. What drives eyeballs? Controversy. It's super simple. So if your business model is about driving controversy to attract eyeballs, you don't think there's a problem. Why are, all the social media networks slowly letting people back onto the network who they banned? Two things. One, they're a little concerned about how do we manage the civil discourse, and they feel like having themselves be the judge of what's good and bad is a hard thing. But I think mostly what it has to do with is, hey, our business isn't going so well. We need more eyeballs. We need more traffic. These are people who drove a lot of traffic, and we can't afford to drive them away. So that's both a holistic problem.
It's a business problem. It's a technology problem. It's an engineering problem. It's a cultural problem. Peter Drucker used to say that culture will eat strategy for breakfast any day of the week. It's certainly true in this case. We are enveloped in engineering of very powerful ideas to essentially capture and hotwire our attention. And if we think about it through this lens, attention is actually something sacred. What I will devote and dedicate my precious conscious time, that is a sacred property. And we are losing the war to powerful engines that are able to rewire us down to the brainstem, and that's partly what's going on.
Well, look, and it's going to get worse. You look at what's going on with these chat bots and the artificial intelligence to be able to send a chat a few set of text strings and say, hey, do this for me, and have it come back with a chapter in a book. Right? As an author, that's a real problem. As a business person, that's a real problem. When I see a presentation from somebody, I wonder who wrote it. And I don't know whether they're good at communication or not. So there's real power in that too. Of course, artificial intelligence has real power. I mean, I get it. There's a lot of things that it does that are really good, but it creates these tensions. And part of being a civic engineer is addressing, how do we tackle those tensions and how do we face up to them in a straightforward way? That's, I think about our education system. If I was a professor and I have to read a 3-page paper now, I have to ask myself who wrote this.
Yes. Yes.
And actually, it's worse. I have to ask, did a human write this?
Yes. Well, so this is a beautiful segue
Sure.
to ask you, why did you write a fiction? What led to the Insurrection story?
Well, when I finished Xbox Revisited, you go through about 12 months of marketing the book and doing all the things that you do to try to sell your book. And I started doing a bunch of public speaking around the book and got into that. And then, about a year after that, I said, okay, it's time to write again. And I literally said, oh, well, I can just write another nonfiction book. I have more to say, right? There's more on those topics that I want to say. And I sat down to start writing that. And I just said, oh man, this is going to be drudgery and boring. And maybe for the readers, hopefully not for the readers, but certainly for me. Writing another nonfiction book did not offer me the challenge that the first one did. I made tons of mistakes writing the first one. It was a college thesis in the first draft, and then you had to turn it into a book. So I learned from that. But writing a second nonfiction, with no disrespect to nonfiction writers, it's a great genre. But for me personally, wasn't the thing I wanted to do. I'm a believer in learning and challenging myself and doing new experiences and being just a little out on the edge. So I said, well, I'm going to write fiction. I've always thought that would be cool. Let me start. And the first draft of the Wilkes Insurrection, which wasn't called the Wilkes Insurrection at that time, but the first draft of that manuscript was 550 pages long. Only 200 pages too much, but it was 550 pages. And that's because I wasn't experienced as a writer. And, there were a lot of good pieces in it. There was a lot of good character ideas, but the scene description wasn't rich. The plot wasn't tense enough and tight enough. There was a whole section a whole theme that I needed to take out because there were too many ideas in the book. And so I had to, I spent 2 years editing the manuscript and working with a professional editor and learning, which for me was the coolest thing. Okay, if you're writing point of view, just a small trivial example as an author. When you write something, do you think about point of view? Most people don't. You're just writing. Well, I have to think about, okay, in each chapter, whose head in the book am I in? Right? And how do I know what they're thinking? And how do I know what the other person's thinking? Because I'm not in their head. And I had written the book as if I knew what everybody was thinking, which is very disorienting for a reader and very hard. And so I had to go through the entire manuscript and say, this chapter I'm in Tamika's head. This chapter I'm in Charles' head. This chapter I'm in somebody else's head. And then rewrite the story from that perspective. So, that kind of learning is just so cool.
Did you find that these are two different processes, the initial creative flow of the ideas, phase one, and then the editing and the reorganizing? Are these two different processes? And what did you learn about getting into those two different parts of your brain?
Yeah, I think, having only written one fiction novel, but my guess from talking to a lot of authors is there's always two parts to the process. There's always the writing, and then there's always the fixing or the editing or the reshaping. I have a friend who's a best-selling author, she's written 5 or 6 really good novels. And what she tells me is, she says, her process is, I write 1,500 words a day and I don't worry how good it is. I just write 1,500 words. And then I come back and I look at it and maybe I'll edit it a little bit then, but I'll keep writing. And then when I'm done, I've got, 250, 300, I've got 250 pages of writing, 300 pages of writing. And then I'll go through and I'll really shape and form and edit and redo it. And every author does it a little bit differently. But I think in all cases, there's a writing, get it out on the page phase, and then there's an editing phase. And they are actually quite different. And I think the thing I've observed is it's really difficult to self-edit. You need a partner. Interesting.
Well, so let's get a little bit into the story. First, First, let me ask you, what do these words mean for you? Just goes to show that you never know just what tomorrow may bring. What do these words mean, and why did you insert them into the book?
At the beginning of the book has 5 parts. And then at the beginning of each part, I picked a quote, which happens to be a song lyric. And that happens to be an Amy Grant song lyric. And Amy Grant's on my top 10 list of favorite artists. You will discover that I am a pop art person. I'm not heavy metal. I'm not rap. I'm right in the middle of pop. And Amy Grant's sort of a cross between country, western, Christian, and pop singer. And her lyrics are super interesting. And those lyrics are the fundamental things about life. We don't know what's going to happen next. To me, it was the perfect lyrics to start the story with. And interestingly, as I'm writing the story, I didn't know what was going to happen next. I did not have an outline. I did not have a plot. And so for me, those lyrics literally transformed into the book. But if I think about most of the things that have happened in my life, good and bad, but let's talk about the good because that's better. Most of them have been acts of serendipity. Things I didn't expect, opportunities that I stumbled across, opportunities somebody brought in front of me. And I can give you 10 examples of fortuitous ball bounces that happened in my life. And I'll give myself only credit for having caught the ball when it bounced in front of me. But those are things. And so that quote, and if you listen to the full song, hey, it's a nice tune. But if you listen to the full song, it's just about all these people who were going one direction and suddenly were going the other direction. And how life, turns on a dime for people. And sometimes it turns on the dime for the bad, of course, but hopefully you find the ones where it turns on the dime for the good.
Well, the mental model you're describing there is one where you can still be the hero of your own story, but it's not a solo story. It really is a story where you discover yourself as a hero inside the context of the larger ecosystem that you're part of. And that goes to the kind of mindset you're bringing to civic engineering. We are always inside a larger system that's operating inside a larger system, even when we think that we are great and that we created everything.
It's one of the things that I'm constantly exploring in my head, and I explore some in the book, is the role of pride and self-authorship and self-direction and self-initiative and humility and the ability to recognize that there are other things at work. And that to me is both a difficult and challenging, but also beautiful tension.
Yes.
And I think, the people I respect the most are the people who get that right. And look, pride is a good thing. I'm proud of the book. I think it's a really good read, and I'm very proud of it. And I will also be the first one to tell you that the first draft of it was not a good book, and that there's a bunch of people, if you read the acknowledgments, there's a bunch of people who helped make it what it is, and that there are things I can do better. And so finding that balance between pride and humility, I think is a life lesson. It's a life adventure. It's a life search. And of course, the thing we were talking about earlier about serendipity and the words from the Amy Grant song, that's what throws the spice into this. Pride cometh before a fall is just the analog to that quote.
Indeed. Well, so let me ask you, who is Tamika Smith? What is driving her and why?
Yeah, I get asked the question, who is Tamika Smith based on? And the short answer is nobody. And the longer answer is lots of different people. So Tamika is a character that's been running around in my head for 20 years. For some interesting background reasons, I have a deep respect for the military. I never served. But my dad served in World War II, and it changed his life in some ways in positive ways, but in some ways in very challenging and difficult ways. I think most of the veterans who came back from World War II had PTSD and nobody knew what it was. nobody thought it was a good thing. They just told people to move on. And my dad was included in that. And so I have a deep respect for what's gone on in the military. I've read tons of military books. I love history. And so Tamika, for me, was a chance to write about that respect and the challenges that flow from that and the power that comes from that. And, my goal in writing that character was to create someone who both had real superpowers and who you could look at and say, oh God, I love her. And at the same time, to our point before about humility, was somebody who was human and who had frailties and made mistakes. And to watch her deal with that real time over the course of the storyline. She also happens to be biracial. And that adds another challenge into her life stream. And she also happens to be a woman, which adds yet a third, sort of line. So you have this military biracial female, which to me is a nexus of so many things that are going on in our country and so many things that go on in our communities and trying to understand them. And, I've obviously worked with lots of women, both as peers, as people who work for me, and as people who I've advised. I've worked with people from all the different ethnicities and races. I'm not an expert on any of those things. I didn't serve in the military. I'm not Black, and I'm a male. And so for me, writing that in a character was cool. It was interesting.
Here is one of Tamika's lines after the attack, without giving all the story out. She says, even if your faith is strong, you'll also need a different type of strength if you want to survive disasters like today. You have to find the grit to confront the crises that are bound to come your way. So what is your deeply held belief and experience with these ideas of faith and grit and strength and confronting crises?
Yeah, when I talk at universities, I do a lot of guest lecturing, and usually that's business strategy, leadership, the things that come from my Microsoft and Xbox experience. But I always, at the end, talk about three things. I talk about faith, I talk about perseverance, and I talk about serendipity. And literally, that little talk from that Tamika gives there is a heavily redacted, modified for the story subset of what I say every time I talk to college students. And for me, faith, look, I'm Catholic. I'm a practicing Catholic. I have a religious faith. So, when I talk to people, if they do, that's great. They understand where I'm coming from. But even if you're not a believer of whatever religion, even if religion isn't part of your life, faith is incredibly important. If you don't believe in some things, if you don't believe in some core social conventions, if you don't believe in yourself, if you don't believe in your friends and your spouse and your family and the people around you, you're going to go through life in, just a really difficult fog. It's going to be no good. And so for me, having that sense of faith is powerful. The second part of that is perseverance. And, again, we talked about a little bit about this. The ability to overcome is, to me, one of the most important character sets people can develop. Life, for whatever reason, I've not talked to anybody who hasn't had three curveballs and a knuckleball thrown at them. Sorry for all the sports analogies, but 3 curveballs and a knuckleball thrown at them in life. We get hit in the face with stuff all the time. Some of it small little road bumps, some of it big mountains. And to me, the determinant in our life of what happens is, what do we do when that happens? Do we have the belief and faith to then persevere? Do we know how to get around things? Do we know how to get over how to overcome challenges? And that to me is just kind of fundamental. And then the last thing is serendipity, which is the topic we've already discussed, which is, hey, opportunity is going to knock. Are you brave enough to grab it?
Yeah, will you see it? Will you recognize it when it shows up? And will you then be ready to respond? Here is another character. This is Tamika's father. Yeah. And in his letter, and I imagine this is another character you give birth to in the interior cosmology that you are cultivating on the inside, right, expressing your core values. And he says, old war horses like me all face the question at some point in their life, am I ready to take on my next gig? Some have made good choices and been able to walk away with their pride and integrity intact. Others have struggled with redefining their purpose and self-worth. When it comes to job and career realignment, timing is everything. Each one of us must ask, am I self-aware enough to know when my time has arrived? So, what has been your journey into self-insight and the sense of pride and self-worth, and recognizing what you already touched earlier, that sense of humility, and recognizing nothing is ever fixed. It's a moving diagram. Timing is the sense of timing is so critical. What has been your journey with this self-awareness?
Yeah, I think early in life, and where early means probably until I was about 35, I was not super self-aware. I was very driven, very motivated, very competitive, achievement oriented. And there's lots of reasons for that, but I was about, put a challenge in front of me and I'd take it. And I'd run with it as hard as I could, and I'd figure it out. And I'm talented in certain ways, and that helped me figure out enough of those things to keep progressing and keep going. And I then hit the Xbox wall, I will say, and ran into a challenge that personally and professionally was way bigger than I was. And to the point, and I talk about this in my first book, Xbox Revisited, where I resigned from Microsoft before Xbox shipped. At 2:00 in the morning, I was working 18-hour days, not seeing my family. I had 3 young kids and a wife I loved. And the business and the work and the effort and the conviction and the competitiveness was destroying me. And at 2:00 in the morning, I sat down and wrote a really lovely, well-written, well-punctuated email to my boss. And the bottom line of that was, thank you very much, drive home safely, I'm out of here. And, he came back to me and he came back to me the next morning and said, come see me. Because if I left, he was going to have to run the project, and he knew he didn't want to do that. So he convinced me to stay and get through the project, but he did more than that. He helped me find help. He helped me find a couple in Topeka, Kansas, named Jack Fitzpatrick and Ann Francis. They are what I would best describe as life coaches. They're both professionally trained psychologists and analysts. My wife and I went and spent a day and a half with them. We wrote our life story before we went, and they helped us reshape the way we were facing life and facing these sets of challenges and thinking through, Jack doesn't even remember saying this because he and I have talked about it since then. But he said to me at one point, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. And the reason he said that is he asked me, he said, why are you still at Microsoft? And I said, because if I leave, the project will fail. And his response to me, well, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. And that kind of hit me in the head. People, I'm not used to people calling me stupid. And I didn't think it was that stupid of a statement. Because I think without leadership, the project would have been in trouble. The project was in trouble anyway, and it would have been in more trouble. And he said, look, if you leave and the project fails, that's your boss's problem. If he wasn't ready to deal with things, that's his problem, not your problem. You need to do what's right for you. You need to step back and decide. If you really want to be successful and continue with Xbox and get it done, great. Get over it and decide to restructure your life so you can do that. If you've decided that you're done and you want to leave, well, leave. And then reshape your life around that.
Well,
that was powerful advice.
Yeah. So before you moved into shaping characters in a story, you're engaged with the re-architecting of your own character and your own story, and there is a direct line in terms of that mindset. You are also exploring in the book the reality of evil and the mystery of why God allows tragedy and suffering. And you integrate this beautiful hymn that says, "Fear not, I am with thee." So you are going all out. You're opening your what these sentiments mean for you. What else would you say from that core belief you have about the mystery of why tragedy and suffering, why is that part of life?
Well, I think there's, on one level, there's what I will say is the sort of superficial obvious, which is without tragedy, we wouldn't know beauty, right? There's this duality of things. And if life was just all roses, we probably wouldn't appreciate it. But I think it goes way, way deeper than that. I think for me, tragedy is a place where we learn. Tragedy is a place where we grow. It's where we triumph. It's where we figure ourselves out. It's where we have to, you go into the dark hole and you look and you say, okay, where am I? Who am I? And what am I doing? And that doesn't mentally or intellectually justify the pain that somebody had to suffer to put you in the hole. The fact that people die from tragic circumstances, or that, there's evil in the world, you can't say that's a good thing. But the way our world operates, and the way sort of the basic ground rules that God has laid out in front of us, to be religious about it for a second, require you to face that self-analysis and to actually think deeply and say, okay, what does that mean for me? Like, I went through being 30 years old, 40 years old, 50 years old, not really thinking about the future of my life. I wasn't worried about how old I was. I was thinking about the future of what I was doing and all those kinds of things. But I didn't think, 50 years old, whatever, fine. I turned 60 last year. I've been thinking about that a lot. It's made me be self-reflective.
Yes.
And it's made me think about, okay, if I'm lucky, 20, 25 years, God, if I'm really lucky, 30 years, what do I want to do?
Yeah.
To me. And so evil in this world forces us to be better. It forces us to think more intentionally. It forces us to decide how we're going to address that. I said earlier, I think a lot about World War II. The transparent, objective evil involved in that time in our world was a powerful motivator for the greatest generation. It is no accident that the group of people we call the greatest generation were the people who served and suffered through World War II. That's not an accident.
And you're also able, inside it all, to channel the benevolence of Islam in a dialogue where one of the characters, here are the words, "We must all overcome our fear. We must proclaim the true meaning of Islam. We must make people understand that Islam means peace." And she says, "I may not practice all aspects of Islam, but it forms the fabric of my principles and beliefs. It shapes who I am and how I care for others. Islam is a faith based in modesty, forgiveness, tolerance, and morality." So when I read this in this paragraph, you've had to find the sense of empathy and embrace of otherness.
Yeah, and again, I think this is something that has. I'm back on the 60 topic. This is something that has come with experience and age. I grew up in a neighborhood that was probably 35% Jewish, a few Lutherans and a few Catholics. It was very upper middle class, wealthy, and white. In fact, I moved to a community in North Carolina that was had no Jews and no Catholics. very few Jewish people and very few Catholics. I moved in a community that had a lot of Moravians, which is a religion I didn't even know about, a lot of Baptists, and let's call it 30% of the population was Black. Right? You start to put on different lenses really quickly, and you start to say, okay, well, I've come from two different diverse universes in a way, and when I think about what happened on 9/11, which was a deeply personal thing for me, and I think about how to identify what was evil in 9/11, Islam, in its truest sense, was in no way evil in 9/11, in my view. And being able to express that so that people could say there was evil on 9/11 and not attribute it to a religion or to something that could be discriminated against or categorized or grouped, that to me is a powerful, powerful lesson. And really an important thing for people to get in their head. And, it's, again, I go back to World War II. The Germans weren't evil, right? Look, who are two of America's greatest allies? Germany and Japan. How ironic is that? Right? Who did we fight in World War II? Germany and Japan. What cultures committed real atrocities during that war? Germany and Japan. But we figured out how not to ascribe it to the people and the culture and the broadest sense. We figured out how to describe it to leaders and individuals who led people down a bad path. And I would say the same thing about Catholicism. Catholicism has some really dark periods in our history. Oh my gosh. I'd say the same thing about most religions.
Who is the leader? Who is the leader of the Lincoln Coalition? I'm guessing that character embodies your deepest beliefs about leadership.
Yeah. The leader of the Lincoln Coalition is Charles Roscovich. And as we were discussing before we started recording, Charles Roscovich is named after my first dog, Charlie, and my second dog, Roscoe. Charles Roscovich actually makes an appearance in my first book, Xbox Revisited, because in my first book, where I'm laying out an approach for government strategy, Charles is my alter ego critiquing some of the things I've said. And we have this back and forth in the book of, that's this is this. It's a bipartisan back and forth in the book. And so Charles embodies all of that. And interestingly, Charles is Jewish. He's an engineer. He's an immigrant. He's a self-made person. He was laser focused on his business and as a result, not laser focused on his family. He made real mistakes in his life. But he is finding, as the story starts, a way to shift. And he's finding a way to turn that to good and to take those experiences and turn them into something else. And the Lincoln Coalition is his idea, which he then embodies in Tamika.
And here are some of the words that he says. He says, the heart of our problems today is lack of leadership. We need a new set of leaders with concrete ideas, the skills to communicate those ideas, and the trust and respect from others to make them happen. We can work together to create equal opportunities without prejudice. And he goes on to speak about creating new solutions that reshape our country. So what is your experience having one side of you in character development, in fiction, and another side of you in DC, talking with real politicians where cynicism often rules the day? What is it we can learn about truly encouraging this kind of leadership, one that's ready to transcend cynicism and evolve inside out?
Yeah, look, I'll say some things that are broad generalizations, which aren't fair, but I think are important to recognize. First off, my generation has to take accountability for where we are. Not my parents' generation, but my generation. And we have allowed this cynicism to seep into our society. And we have allowed a lack of strong leadership to seep in. And we are giving a world, as we move towards retirement, to a next generation that is really getting handed a not very good situation. So I think the first thing you have to look at is you have to say, with all due respect to the people in my generation, do I think we're going to be the ones explicitly who will solve this problem? Maybe. We're only 60. My generation's 60 years old, let's call it that. So there's still time. But I mostly look to the people who are in their 30s and 20s, 30s and 40s. And I say, look, it's going to be your world. If the environment's going to be fixed and we're still going to be able to keep the lights on, you're going to have to be the ones to figure out how to do that. Right? If the country's not going to go bankrupt, you're going to have to be the ones who fix that. If we're not going to have World War III, you're the ones who are going to have to deal with that. Or if any of those bad things happen, it's going to be your problem because you'll have 30, 40, 50, 60 years of your life to deal with it. And this is why I do spend a lot of time on college campuses. And when I speak to corporations and to trade shows and industry groups, I get paid. When I speak on college campuses, I do it because it's passion and I think it's important. And that's where, look, I hope there's a leader who's 50, 60 years old who comes to the forefront and magically helps us change things. But I think it's more likely that it's going to come from the next generation.
And one of the themes he describes there is the importance of leaders working across government, business, and civic organizations. So that's the threefolding idea that's been around for about a century. And what is it we're learning? Again, this is where we started the conversation. What is it we're learning about being able to bring those three different important streams in society? Today, they are not truly fully self-arising because they are very intractable in the way they developed the dysfunctionality and the pathologies in each other. So letting these three streams evolve independently and cross-moderate each other and develop shared philosophies, shared solutions for a unified future, this is really the crux of the challenge.
It totally is. And for me, like, what's the beauty of the American system? I'm a proud American. My wife is Dutch. She's a proud European, and I get it. But in the American model, there are three legs on the stool. There's a business leg that is way more powerful in the US than it is in most countries. There's a government leg that is actually less powerful in the US than it is in most countries because we have a federalist system that disperses power amongst the states and the governments and the counties and the cities. It makes it harder to get things done. Fact. And we have a nonprofit sector that is way larger than it is in any other country, in part because government doesn't do some of those things. So we cede that to private organizations to make that happen. So if America is going to stay great, if we're going to continue to be successful doing the things that we've done historically, all three legs of that stool have to stand up. And they have to stand up together. And they have to be, and the hardest part about this is they have to be self-disinterested. Mm-hmm. Right? If business is just focused on business, that won't work. If the nonprofits are just focused on fundraising, that won't work. If the government is just focused on who's in power and who gets to nominate the next Supreme Court justice, that won't work. And so finding leaders in each of those pods, if you will, that are self-disinterested is really complicated. And you got to do it in the world. We talked about this earlier. You got to do it in the world in which you're going to be dealing with people who have pride. You're going to be dealing with people who have ego. And you have to decide that that's good and how to turn that pride and ego to self-disinterest. That's a difficult challenge.
There is a point where Tamika's father says the real battle is with an enemy in our midst. He's clothed today as a terrorist, but the real source of his power is grounded in ignorance, poverty, hopelessness, fear, and anger. Yeah. So again, you're there shaping an observation and insight about the human condition. And what locks us in an entrenched position that prevents us from seeing possibility and prevents us from being ready to transcend the limited self-interest for the greater good for all. And in a way, I felt that in this paragraph, again, you are channeling your deepest passion about what leadership is for. Leadership is to confront these challenges and invite us as citizens to embrace exactly all the answers to this, to counter ignorance with learning and education and curiosity, to counter hopelessness and fear with the readiness to embrace the rejuvenation of the human spirit, and so on and so forth. What was it that you're trying to communicate in this moment in the book?
You captured it. You captured it quite well there. I mean, I think for me, the American experiment is about the middle. It's about the bell curve and what happens in the middle of that bell curve. And when the bell curve gets torn apart and you have extremes on one end and extremes on the other, we get a problem. So what's happened in our country? Income distribution has gotten completely lopsided. Wealth has gotten completely lopsided. Upward mobility has been restricted. Quality of education has gone down. These are all things that affect the middle. These are all the pathways to a strong, healthy, what I call the silent majority. And if we look and say, pick silly things like the way our tax law works. The way our tax law works, we have over the last 25 years absolutely enabled people to pile up wealth. And look, I've did well at Microsoft. You can put me in that category. I'm not in the super part of the category, but I'm in the category. And we've allowed that to happen. How many billionaires were there 25 years ago? Being a billionaire was a big deal 25 years ago. It's not a big deal anymore. I know that sounds crazy, but it's true. And we've glorified that wealth as, oh, these guys are the smartest people, we should just follow them. I mean, I think of like Elon Musk. Obviously smart guy, obviously very successful. What's he focused on? If he's focused on acquiring more wealth, then he's not going to be part of that three-legged stool. and so we've allowed that to happen.
And this brings me to maybe the last quote from the book. There is a wistful moment after an arousing speech from Tamika as a senator. And when she is reflective to herself, and she says, maybe life was less about the medals and more about the commitment, less about the success and more about the people, less about the destination and more about the journey. And I intuit that in many ways these are your words and how you feel about your life and your journey.
100%. And it's, that comes from, you will not find a more competitive person than me. You will not find somebody who's more achievement oriented than me. You'll not find somebody who's tried to be successful all his life and has, really, and on reflection, look, all those traits are good. They're just good when channeled, and they're good when put to the right use and put in the right perspective, and put in the right opportunity to do great things. I mean, if you think about our great leaders, did Franklin Roosevelt have a gigantic ego? Well, the answer is absolutely yes. But he also had a life disability that changed the way he thought about people who had to go through that challenging time. And he had an amazing ability to think about those things. So,
well, he was the one. He was probably more ready than any other person to, by definition, to confront a country that was crippled at the time of its crippledness, having had to embrace his own struggle with being crippled. So right there, the definition of needing to embody what it is you're struggling with as a vehicle to invite people to their opportunity.
Yeah, and look, I think there's a word there's two words that are sort of big on my mind right now. One of them is grace, and that quote that you just gave from Tamika is about grace. It's about the grace that comes in our life to recognize what's going on around us, what's happened to us, where we're going, where we're headed, and to be content with that.
Mm.
And to know that there's been purpose along the way, there's been achievement along the way, there's been failure along the way, and that's as it should be. And that, it has been about the journey. And then the second word that I think goes as sort of a corollary to grace and goes with that is the word gratitude, which gets used a fair amount at the beginning of a new year. Everybody says, oh gosh, we should think about how grateful we are. But really looking through your life and saying, okay, do I have gratitude for both the good and the bad things? When I was 13, I had developed this condition called kyphosis, which is a curvature of the spine. I had a 40-degree forward curve in my spine. And I had to wear this big honking metal back brace with a bar down the front and a leather girdle around my waist, 2 bars up the back and a ring here. And I saddled into it. And I wore that for between 20 and 23 hours a day for 5 years, all through high school. And, was that a good thing? No, it sucked. And yet it changed my life. And I am grateful for that experience. It forced me to focus on school. It helped me to think about what I could become. It forced me to overcome challenges, to see people who had challenges in a different light. It gave me a completely different lens on the world. I probably grew up 10 years earlier than I needed to, but that's okay. So figuring those things out is really important.
So finally, as we bring this to close, Robbie, there is a sense that we have entered perhaps a longer decade of transformation. You said earlier things are going to get worse. People that study cycles like to talk about this phase that we've entered as winter, and some will even say that this may be harsh winter. And so perhaps the words you just offered there, even in winter, there may be an opportunity, and perhaps even more opportunity and more greater importance to reach for grace and to reach for gratitude. But what else would you invite us to, as a brief, as an awareness, as a guidance, as we think about the future? This is the focus of the Portal's inquiry. How do we facilitate a better, healthier, more enlightened future for all of us?
Well, look, I do think we're in a time of transformation. I do think we're in the 1930s. I think we're in the 1850s. Right? I think we're in the turn of the century, 1890s, all of which were times of great transformation, not just in our country, but in the world, but certainly in the United States. And they all were times that were sort of before things got really dark. And unfortunately, I think things probably are going to get a little darker before they get light. And so when I posit that and I say that, I can say that with a little bit of a smile on my face, only because I think that's when the opportunity is the greatest. And to me, the thing I challenge everybody with is, look, things aren't good right now. That's fact. There's lots of different ways to measure that. We got a lot of problems, a lot of challenges, but we have the chance to transform the country for the next 100 years. And I can think about that in a business context. I can think about that in a social context. I can think about that in a political context. And you can't make that change when things are good. In the middle of summer, there's not a lot of change going on. Things are sort of green. The weather sort of is what it is. And you're sort of waiting for something to happen. In winter, look, something new is going to come from this. The question is, do we see the opportunity to shape it or not? If we just let it happen, what will come may not be to our liking. If we see it as an opportunity, we can shape it and turn it into something that is to our liking, that is wonderful, and that gives us the ability for that next generation that I was talking about to have a really fruitful and intentional adventure as we discussed earlier.
What is your closing message, your parting message when you are on campuses meeting with those youngsters and they are today, all the data points is they're more worried, they're more filled with anxiety, they less hopeful. What is your current closing message to them?
It's the first point I already made, which is, as dark as I think it may look for you right now, and particularly in the middle of the pandemic, I'm talking to a bunch of business school people, and they're like, there's not going to be any jobs for me when I get out. My daughter's in business school right now. She's going to come into a job market that's not going to be very good, but that's where the opportunity lies. So opportunity is actually quite rich. And it may not on the surface look that way, but the opportunity is quite rich. The second thing I tell people is get help. And maybe that sounds a little strange, but look, so many people who I think like me, who are type A, achievement oriented, leadership oriented, whatever, we all think we can solve our own problems. And we all want to be self-reliant. That's sort of an American thing. And while I think self-reliance is a nice thing, my visit to Topeka, Kansas, and Jack Fitzpatrick and Ann Francis taught me that when you need help, you need help. So if you're dealing with anxiety, find a way to talk about it. Find a way to deal with it. Find a way to turn it into something more productive for you. Find a friend, find a counselor, find a coach, find a mentor, a spouse, whomever it is. And don't be shy about asking for help and getting the help that you need. And then the third thing I tell people is, take the long road. If you think you know where you're going for the road of your life, I got news for you. The likelihood that, there's a few exceptions. Look, if you're going to be a doctor, you better know where you're going because it's a long way just to even get there. But there's a few exceptions. But for most people, you're 22. Did I ever think I'd run a video game company? I don't even play video games. And that never even crossed my mind. Did I think I'd be involved in technology? Never crossed my mind. So take the long road, have a plan, and then know it's going to change and be excited about the change. And so when you graduate, you may not have exactly the job you thought you might have. You might have to start in a different area. You might have to go zag a little bit to be successful or to get started, but that's okay. Then you'll develop a plan from there, and that plan will evolve. And so the point that Tamika makes at the end of the book, if you think about it as the journey and that's the power, maybe some of the anxiety can drop off. And maybe the immediacy of, I have to have this answer right now because somebody is text messaging me and social media is pressuring me to be someone I'm not. Maybe I can let that go a little bit.
Thank you very much for sharing Tamika's message, your message, on this Portals exploration. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Along with our website at portalsofperception.org, Portals is also available on YouTube and on all podcast platforms, as well as social media. You can become an active member and join the conversation in community events. And you can help us get the word out by liking this content and by sharing it with your friends.